Hello and welcome to The Briefing, a weekly conversation with leaders and experts to explore the ideas shaping our democracy today. I'm Michael Waldman, president of the Brennan Center for Justice. The Presidency. It is one of the singular aspects of American constitutional government. And from Washington to Lincoln to Reagan and to the recent past, presidents were drivers of American progress. At least that's what I always thought. But the office was always prone to abuse and needed guardrails and constitutional protections. Now we're in the second year of Donald Trump's second term as president. What we have seen, what we have experienced, and what we are dealing with and often combating every day raises the question, what does this say about the presidency? Is this just a continuation of long-term trends of inherent qualities of the office, or is this something new, a break? What do we do to return the office to its proper scale and its proper place in our constitutional order? What is that place? I'm thrilled to discuss this with David Frum. He is a staff writer at The Atlantic, a longtime leading conservative thinker, the author of 10 books. He was a speechwriter for George W. Bush when he was president, and is the host of The David Frum Show, a tremendous podcast. David has given a lot of thought to this very question, to what's new, what's not new about this moment of peril for our Constitution. And I should say David is an old friend of mine. David, you and I both in our careers have at various points been proponents of a strong presidency. But you've also written that this moment really marks a break. How do you see right now, thinking broadly about the presidency, where we are?
Well, let's think about the presidency from the point of view of the people who created it in the 1780s. They had emerged from the experience of the British monarchy, and they inherited a constitutional tradition from England and Scotland. And that constitutional tradition had three major elements, which is the king cannot tax by himself, or you cut his head off. The king cannot spend by himself, or you cut his head off. And the king cannot arrest and bother members of parliament, or you cut his head off. And that was not a theoretical proposition. They'd actually cut one head off on exactly those three issues, and they chased another king out of the country, James II, half a century later, because they thought he was about to repeat the trick. So no taxing without parliament, no spending without parliament, and no harassing members of parliament for things they say in their capacity as members of parliament. So as everyone will instantly recognize from my description of these things, all of those principles have been jettisoned in the second Trump term. President Trump's tariffs are taxing, the last time I looked, about $40 billion a month. How much is $40 billion? Well, his biggest populist proposal is the no tax on tips, which started at the beginning of, or in the middle of 2025 and is set to expire at the end of 2028. Over the entire life of the no tax on tips program, it is set to cost the Treasury less than $40 billion. So 1 month of these taxes without Congress pays for his entire big act of help for middle and working class people. He's spending without control of Congress, because when you take your tariff revenue, which you raise without Congress, and then say, I'm giving it to the farmers, or I'm using it for this, or I'm using it for that, you're spending without Congress. And then, of course, we have seen the attempted indictments and prosecutions of 2 senators and 4 House members for things they said in the course of their business as parliamentarians.
You know, you note that this was something that they were aware of having been done in Great Britain, where there was a civil war and a revolution about this.
Yes.
They were very explicit, as we all know, when you look at the notes from the Constitutional Convention, things we think that they might have vaguely been aware of. They were very explicit. At one point, Ben Franklin says, in discussing the need to have an impeachment power, he said, well, there's 2 ways to hold an executive accountable: assassination and impeachment. And impeachment's probably better because it gives you more of a chance to correct a mistake. Yeah. But they also didn't really know what they were creating, because they had this concept of the monarch as the strong executive. And when James Wilson, one of the great drafters of the Constitution, stood up to talk about Article 2, it was not, of course, Article 1, which was Congress. Article 2, that there would be, he said, I propose that we have a single president. As opposed to a committee, say, at which a lot of the states had as their basis. And because George Washington was sitting there, they were all dumbstruck. Madison's notes say a considerable pause ensued. And then finally someone says, well, I guess that's that. We ought to vote on this. Mm-hmm. And only Ben Franklin had the stature to say, actually, this is a pretty important thing. We ought to debate it. But they didn't really debate it. Yeah. They created an office with potential extraordinary power, but no clear lines about what the president should do. And I've believed, and I believe you have believed, that actually the development of the presidency as a strong focus in our governmental system has not all been bad. In fact, has often been a driver of progress, but it's often been a driver in ways that are very unfamiliar to us right now. They're not the way Trump is using the presidency.
Well, I want to make a point about the strong presidency that will address directly the concerns of many people. Typically, they tend to be on the more liberal side of American politics who have made the case for parliamentary systems. I was born in Canada. I grew up in Canada. I've lived much of my life in parliamentary systems. I did a lot of work in Great Britain during the period around Brexit, another parliamentary system. What American advocates of a parliamentary system believe, wrongly, is that in a parliamentary system, the Congress would be more powerful. In fact, it's less powerful. That Congress is much more powerful than the British or Canadian or Australian parliaments, or the Australians call it a Congress too. And the reason for that is in Britain, in Canada, in a Westminster-style system, once the executive gets a majority in the legislature, there is no more legislature. And the entire executive branch, if you think of the executive branch as being the civil service, it is largely in control and unbeholden to the legislature. And the Canadian Parliament is vastly weaker than the American Congress. The British Parliament is considerably weaker than the U.S. Congress because the non-separation of powers means that the executive ends up devouring the legislature. And one of the unexpected features of the strong presidency, and maybe it wasn't intended to be so strong at the beginning, but of the strong presidency that has emerged was that until very recently, and this is why we're in a crisis now, Congress has retained much more independence of the executive than it does in Westminster or other parliamentary systems.
Because Congress is elected separately and has its own sovereignty and its own claim in some ways on public legitimacy. We were both presidential speechwriters, and at some point or another, every president says, I'm the only one who was elected by the whole public. But of course, Congress, too, was elected by the whole public. Now that contest between the branches has often been a source of strength, but also, and we had Yuval Levin on, and he thinks that is really Congress's role is the key, and that contest between the branches is the strength of America. But it's also been a source of weakness in other parts of the world that have copied our system, which is basically largely Latin America. Other countries have not copied the way we do it. But when we look at history, we mark the presidencies of Washington, of Lincoln, of FDR and Reagan and others as being not just kind of famous people who we can remember them, but actually people who drove public opinion and moved the legislature. And a lot of what they all did was actually to persuade Congress to go along. What's different about now? I mean, you really have argued that this is a breach in the constitutional order, what we see with Trump. And both in your books in the first term and more recently.
I think you've seen an attack those are on of the four drivers. So the four markers of the constitutional limits: the spending power, the taxing power, speech and debate, and finally the war power. In this second Trump term, Trump has made successful attacks. In the first term, there were attempted attacks, but in the second term, there have been to-date successful attacks. Trump has broken free of the Congress's power over taxes. He has broken free of Congress's power over spending. And if he, in the end, is pulled back to earth on taxes, it won't be because of Congress. It will be because the Supreme Court told him that his tariffs are unconstitutional.
And it is possible that between when we're taping this conversation and when it airs, that the court may rule on the tariff case.
Yes. And we can go into some of the details of what's involved there and why the court must do it. But the point is, what we would all have thought a decade ago is that if there were a president who said to Congress, I intend to tax $40 billion a month without you, Congress would have had something. We wouldn't wait around for the Supreme Court. Congress would have taken action. Congress would have refused to the Senate would have refused to confirm appointees. They would have blockaded money. They would have found other ways to signal to the executive this is not permissible. Same thing with the spending. That happened in the first term. There was spending without Congress. The giveaways he gave to the farmers to compensate them for the first round of his trade war. Congress didn't vote on those. And now the attacks on speech and debate. And we are about to see another thing that may happen between the time we record and the time you post is we may find ourselves in a major shooting war with Iran, with a very uncertain outcome, and that's not an air raid, that's not a special forces abduction of the chief executive, both of which are warlike actions, but have things like that have happened in the past without Congress feeling like its prerogatives were infringed? But I mean, we're on the verge of what may be.
This is a real war with a real country.
A real war with a real country with no clear way to end and with goals that are very ambitious. And that's the war power. And that seems to be claimed without consent of Congress. So Congress is being blocked out of all kinds of functions. And finally, there's an attack on the central theory of the presidency. As you have written and have often said, that the central thing that the people of 1780s told themselves to reassure themselves of the presidency was this is an office that was going to be held by men and then later women too of above the common stature, of people of integrity. And they worried about the Cromwells and they didn't know about Napoleon Bonaparte quite yet, but they could see him coming. They worried about men like that.
Caesar.
But they did think these would be large figures and that there would be some pressure on them to behave themselves because of their extraordinary visibility. The breakdown of ethics, big and small, everything from don't take bribes to don't mock the dead when they've been murdered in a tragic way. Every one of those moral constraints out the window, and again, so far, without breaking the president's hold on his own party.
And even thinking about what has gone on in Minneapolis in recent weeks, the occupation and assault on an American city, which in American history, the closest thing I can think of is what the British did to Boston in the run-up to the Revolution. It's not unknown. It's not unfamiliar in the sweep of history. It's extraordinarily unknown in the context of the U.S. experience and our experiment with democracy.
Minnesota, Minneapolis reminds me very much of a colonial war. And the kind of thing that a foreign power would do while trying to keep peace in a turbulent city. But this brings us to, I think, a piece of happy news that I want to emphasize. And it goes. You mentioned this point about how the other countries that have had strong presidencies, which are except for France, mostly in Latin America, have had very unhappy histories with them. But it's turned out the true safety belt for the presidency is not Congress, which has been not so successful recently, but the federal system. And while many Latin American countries purport to be federal systems, Mexico is theoretically a federal state. In fact, the center is very strong and the states are very weak. In the United States, that's not true. And that has been one of the real barriers on what Trump has tried to do in Minnesota. Is at some level, when people are harassed by ICE, what is their first demand? Where are the cops?
Right.
We've got our own cops who pay for us. Maybe the cops will protect us from ICE.
But this is one of the moments of clarification for somebody like me. My whole life, I've believed in a strong presidency leading a strong federal government, and that states' rights was a euphemism for racism or small thinking or special interest balkanization. Yeah. And the fact that states have their own sovereignty, the fact that they have their own constitutional systems and legal systems is an extraordinarily important bulwark, it turns out, right now to protect people.
One other very technical detail, the fact that the National Guard is fundamentally a state organization. Now, the president can federalize the National Guard at any time, of course. So people assume, well, that means, it's basically a federal force. But you and I have both done watched some exercises where the people who are very expert play this out. And what a president soon discovers, even this one, is that National Guard disproportionately recruit from first responders in the states. So when you federalize the National Guard and move it out of the state, what you are really doing is taking away emergency medical personnel, law enforcement personnel, fire people. It's not everybody.
These are not people who signed up to be warriors.
No, they sign up to help their neighbors. They are ready to be warriors, and many of them are former warriors. But what they really signed up for was floods, natural disasters, civil disturbances that are caused by wrongdoers, not by poorly trained federal authorities. But they mostly stay to be pretty close to home most of the time, except in the case of a real national emergency. So when you say, I'm taking the Arizona National Guard and moving them to the District of Columbia for weeks. They have jobs, but they also, many of those jobs are in indispensable sectors back in Arizona. Where's the fire department? They're in D.C. picking up the trash.
Right. And, of course we see the strength, we hope, of the federal system when it comes to the election, which you and I have spoken about on your podcast. What we now understand much more viscerally than before is that states run elections in our country. Congress has an appropriate role in passing national legislation. Presidents have no role. Yeah. And despite all the fulmination, the demand to nationalize the elections, the claim now that there's going to be another executive order establishing rules and voter ID rules without Congress and without states, that actually cannot happen.
Well, this is where we're building to a much heavier contest in 2026 than we did in 2020. Because the thing that Trump understands now that I think he genuinely did not understand in 2020 and 2021 is in the United States, in any modern bureaucratic state, you cannot organize an armed mob. A lightly armed mob to seize power. It just doesn't work. The police forces, even if one way or another you make sure the National Guard isn't there, even if the Capitol Police are overwhelmed, the mob, even if they win, even if they take Congress, even if they kidnap Nancy Pelosi and do whatever to Mike Pence they were planning on doing, it's still, you wouldn't have changed the legal reality.
He still probably would not have been president.
No, he would have been in more trouble. And it would have been tragic, but he would not have stayed president. If you want to hold power illegally, you need to co-opt parts of the bureaucracy. You cannot do this entirely extra legally. And Trump understands that in 2026. And a large part of what he has been doing in these first 2 years, this first year and a bit on his way to 2 years of his first term, is to build some kind of quasi-legal apparatus. That's why they're trying to suborn the military in the way they're doing. That's why you see these efforts to rewrite election laws, because conjuring up a mob won't get the job done.
And the massive expansion in the size of ICE and the domestic immigration forces, which will be if they grow it to the full size, the budget passed by Congress envisions, will be the third largest military force in the world after the U.S. Army and the Chinese Army.
Right. And everyone at ICE will know if Trump loses power, even if they're reasonably non-political, they all know that if Trump loses power, ICE may not be abolished, but ICE will shrink. And we're talking about people's livelihoods here. And right. They've got these $50,000 bonuses that are paid in over 5 years. That the last year of the bonus will occur in the next presidency. The
last year of the bonus and the statute of limitations, both are in the next presidency.
So ICE will have important bureaucratic reasons for seeing continuity of the Trump administration in some way or another.
I want to quickly turn to one other thing you've written about a lot before we ask the question of, well, what can be done about this, what is being done, and what can be done in the future, which is the corruption and personal aggrandizement aspect of this. Adding to this notion of a breach is how much this president has used office to self-aggrandize, to make money, and in a way, for a long time in our country, as you know, corruption is not a new thing in human history. We had Graft, we had Tammany Hall, we had the spoils system. Yeah. That was actually largely dealt with early in the 20th century. Then there was, I would argue, a more systemic corruption of the campaign finance system. Now both have roared back, and we have a fusion of public power and private wealth. And Trump is not the only person involved in this, but it's emanating out from the Oval Office. And the power over the executive that he now holds has enhanced his ability to be corrupt.
Yeah. People compare Trump to other moments in American history in the corruption vector. I don't think there's any comparison, because even in the heyday of what we would now call American political corruption, in the years after the Civil War, from the Civil War to the First World War, what was going on? Look, there were governors and mayors who got rich. who plundered, who got contracts, who took bribes. And there were certainly members of state legislatures who did that, and probably members of the House and Senate too. But presidents didn't. What presidents did was they oversaw a system where money was collected for party purposes in ways that weren't exactly illegal, but weren't legal, but were certainly not to be publicized. So in the immediate years after the Civil War, there would literally be a tax. If you got a job for the federal government.
This was the spoil system.
Yeah, you'd kick back 2 or 3% of your salary to the party fund. And there, of course, there were no receipts. There was no accounting. And later that got a little tidied up. But I think many people have seen the Garfield movie, Death by Lightning.
Yes.
And what the villain of it is a man named Roscoe Conkling, who was a senator from New York and who is seen as the great spokesman of the old unreformed system. In fact, he has this famous line where he said, when Samuel Johnson said, patriotism is the last refuge of the scoundrel, and Roscoe Conkling said, when Dr. Johnson said that famous remark, he was underestimating the power of the word reform. But Roscoe Conkling was impeccably personally honest. He didn't take money for himself. What he was doing was taxing salaries to be used for the benefit and glory of the Republican Party, in which he believed. And he would not.
He didn't get a jet from Qatar, and he didn't get crypto.
Yeah. He didn't get a jet,
and put his name on the Kennedy Center. And
when his political career was over in 1881, again, I recommend the series to people. When his political career was over, he went to work practicing law, and was a very successful lawyer, and he made an independent fortune out of the practice of law. But he didn't have anything when he left the Senate in 1881, and that's the way that they thought it should be. That they drew a distinction between seeking benefits from government employees, seeking benefits from corporations that had business before the government for the party, which they thought was a necessary compromise, and for oneself. But the scale, Grant didn't do anything like this. Harding didn't. There was corruption around Harding. Harding himself seems to have been just kind of oblivious and clueless and unworthy. Richard Nixon was not about money. I mean, I think he chiseled a little, but
he got a helipad at San Clemente, but that kind of thing. That was about it.
Yeah, like tens of thousands of dollars.
And so, sticking with the unexpected James Garfield reference, how do we get to our Chester Arthur moment of actually perhaps unexpected reform?
Right.
Again, if it is right that this has been a breach in the constitutional order, as you've described it, almost an experiment in a different form of government.
Yeah.
And we're learning every day that people really don't like many, many aspects of it. Do you think there is a moment where we will have a time for a response, a reform, a reconstruction? Throughout history, our history, after scandal and after abuse comes reform, but not always.
Yeah.
But that is when it comes. Do you think that we can have a moment like that, and what would that entail from your perspective?
I think we'd better. Look, there was a decision made in 2021 by President Biden, by Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, and by people around them. I don't know if they ever quite articulated it the way I'm about to, where they decided it's best to look forward, not backward. From the vantage point of 2021, you could say, look, Donald Trump, he was an aberration. He won in 2016 by a fluke of the Electoral College. He had 2 points fewer of the popular vote than Hillary Clinton. Just something weird happened, a disaster that was always possible. But he lost the House of Representatives handsomely in 2020. He lost power in 2021. In 2020, he lost the Senate in 2021. The people have spoken. They don't want any part of this. His career is obviously over. Ron DeSantis, unpleasant person maybe, but he's obviously the rising man.
Right.
So let's look forward, not backward. And Biden had a big agenda, and he didn't want to take time for institutional reform, which appeals to the Democratic Party. Problem is it's way too popular with people who get excited about institutional reforms, and not popular enough with people who care about bread and butter issues.
Right.
So Biden decided, not crazy decision, I'm going to do more bread and butter, less institutional. Not going to do
We're not going to Trump-proof the government because he's gone.
He's gone, and DeSantis is coming, and we'll deal with DeSantis when he arrives. And that, again, not crazy. It just turned out to be really a catastrophic error. And the next administration, if there is a transition to one that is more in line with the traditions of American government, will have a choice to make. But there are actually two separate but related things. And one is Trump-proofing the government, fixing points of vulnerability, and the other is accountability for those who did bad things.
When have we done that second part well in our country's history? Or what makes you think it could happen?
By and large, the United States has opted not to do it. One of the geniuses of American life is the lack of recrimination. And the decision is almost always made. Thomas Jefferson succeeding Adams, after when Barack Obama took power in 2009, there are many people in the Barack Obama administration had visions that terrible crimes had been committed by
Dick Cheney
and George Bush, and Obama said, no, we are not doing that. So it's been one of the grand traditions, always turn the page. And the most extreme example is, of course, Lincoln after the Civil War saying his personal preference was that the leading Confederates go to Brazil. He didn't want to hang any of them. So it's a departure. But in this case, I don't know that the United Arab Emirates people who successfully put $500 million in the pocket of the president's family, and they're still going to be on the world stage. I mean, is the message really? Well, you better amortize your bribe faster because this could be a one-term bribe, and you better get what. But they've already gotten the permission to move strategically vital chips from the United States to the United Arab Emirates. Whatever they were paying for, they've already got it. So there may need to be some measure of accountability, and there are lots of elements of graft and grift. That's a separate matter from the matter of how do you make it so the government is more stringent.
Constitutionally, institutionally, and structurally back more where it ought to be.
Let me give you a real-world example of something that could happen and its limits. So one thing that the next administration could do, if there is one, about these massive bribes is there is a law in the books called the Global Magnitsky Act, which allows the president to apply sanctions to foreign nationals, not Americans, who have engaged in extreme corruption. So you can do things like deprive them of the right to enter the United States. You can freeze assets they have in the United States. You can forbid Americans to do business with them under certain conditions. But there's no due process under the Global Magnitsky Act, so it can't be applied to Americans. One of the questions I have is, do you need a domestic version of the Global Magnitsky Act with process where you can say, if a government official has done something that has fallen through the wreckage that the Supreme Court has made of the bribery statutes over the past 15 years.
The McDonald case and other cases like that.
Yeah, it's amazing that everybody doesn't take bribes because it's almost it's like a kind of affectation not to take bribes. So the Supreme Court has said,
it's the American way.
Help yourselves, boys.
Yeah,
an extra scoop on the way out the door. Maybe you need some version of that where you can now. You may not be able to apply it retroactively. The UAE people, the Qatar people, they could feel it. You could say to the people who gave that airplane to Trump. Now maybe they were extorted. Maybe it was more of an extortion than a bribe. But you could say to many people around the world, we're global Magnitskying you because of what you did to the last president.
And there are other and of course, even domestically, Jamie Dimon, first time he's been quoted reverently on this podcast, said, well, I'm not going to give money to that ballroom. Mm-hmm. There's going to be laws enforced eventually on this stuff.
Well, I wrote a history of the 1970s and a long time ago. And one of the things I discovered was when Congress introduced campaign finance restrictions after Watergate, the people who were most excited about it were corporate CEOs. Because CEO after CEO –
Because they didn't need to give anymore? Or
yeah, because we're in a different America. This is 1974, 75. CEOs make a lot less money,
right.
Not only in absolute, but relative to anybody else. So when you were the CEO of, say, an airline, and the president's reelection committee said, we need $100,000 from you or you're going to receive unfavorable –
Back when that was real money.
It would be a fifth of the man's salary, a quarter of the man's salary for a year. And it was not just something you could lightly toss off. And so you had – I'm thinking particularly of airline CEOs saying $2,000 feels – about as much as I want to give.
This was George Steinbrenner's defense at the time, actually, as it happened. But yeah, no, it was.
I don't know that story.
Well, he was criminally convicted before he owned the Yankees of being an illegal campaign contributor to Nixon, and he said I was extorted. I had no choice but to give, and it was a lot of money from me. So what are some of the kinds – we at the Brennan Center, as I think you know, have been very focused over the years on the emergency powers, which have been lying around mostly unused since the 1700s and in many instances or used appropriately, or there was self-restraint involved with their not being used. This is something where there has been, up until now, intriguing left-right, Democrat, Republican consensus, although within Congress, we worked, for example, with Rand Paul, but the Biden White House was never terribly enthusiastic about looking for real at the Insurrection Act, looking for real at these other statutes, at the National Emergencies Act. If you were advising a next president, if you were advising a next Congress after the smoldering embers are put out around us, what should they focus on as a legal and statutory matter, and what about norms, and how do we restore some of the norms?
Well, some of this is just gardening, that you have to fix things after every few generations. So the statute that Trump has relied upon to impose tariffs is called IEEPA. I forget exactly what it stands for, International Emergency
Economic Emergency Powers Act.
Okay. So IEEPA was written in the 1970s as the replacement for World War I and World War II trading with the enemy acts, which gave the president vast powers over the economy.
It was an attempt to limit the ability of a president to do this.
Right. And exactly. And one of the reasons why Trump, I think, has to lose this case is even the Trading with the Enemies Act did not give the president power to impose permanent revenue-raising tariffs.
It would be like a president being able to personally set income tax rates at his whim.
So if you couldn't do that under the law that was supposed to be made narrow, it's very clear under the Trading with the Enemy Act you couldn't do it. So if you couldn't do it under the Trading with the Enemy Act, and then Congress in 1974 says we need to narrow the Trading with the Enemy Act, then I would think statutory construction would say that the tariff power can't be in this smaller law. But still, the law is too big, and now we need to go rewrite. We need some kind of international economic emergency. You can well imagine many circumstances where the president would need to be able to do things in a freeze a bank account with no notice. But there has to be some after-the-fact due process. There has to be expiry dates. There has to be time limits.
What about the Justice Department and some of the other ways in which power is being abused right now in a strictly domestic context? I mean, we had a conversation with some former senior Justice Department people who now work at the Brennan Center last week. And the notion of Justice Department independence wasn't entirely the way it was throughout most of American history. You had, of course, President Kennedy appointed his younger brother. Nixon appointed his campaign manager as Attorney General, but that was not that unusual. That was not seen as itself a breach of norms. But we see right now with the way Trump is and his administration are using this Justice Department, again, an extraordinary break from anything that came before. I think that the attempt to indict the 6 members of Congress for protected speech under the Constitution, but even if they weren't members of Congress, for protected speech, and the refusal to get even a single vote from a grand jury member for this, because it didn't happen, the magnitude of it as an extraordinary authoritarian move can almost elude us. What should they do about things like that and about the Justice Department? And how do you do it without hindering the ability to have an effective government?
That is one of the less challenging. There are many questions I find very challenging, but it seems to me the answer is U.S. attorneys should be career civil servants appointed with civil service protection. The idea that you've got a political U.S. attorney, and the head of the criminal division should be a civil servant as well. It's in many countries the equivalent of the attorney general is effectively a civil servant. I mean, if a German chancellor proposed to
in Israel, for example, right?
Yeah. The most so in the one case I know best is the German case, where they have a tradition where the attorney, when they have coalition governments, and there's a strong tradition, the equivalent of the attorney general and the chancellor are always from different parties. That's just one of the unspoken rules of German cabinet making, and then the head of their criminal justice prosecution is picked by the attorney general in consultation with the president of the state, and the chancellor has no role.
And this, I assume, is something we encourage them to do when we help them construct their democracy after World War II.
But they had the they didn't have to fit everything into the unitary executive theory where, well, if the Attorney General isn't a member of the President's cabinet, then what is the Attorney General? We don't have to deal with the Attorney General. We can just say the head of the criminal division could be a civil servant, and all the U.S. attorneys could certainly be civil servants. And then you spend your career in the Justice Department would be that's the before you go to the bench, the crowning glory. You're a U.S. attorney from your early 40s to your late 40s, and that's your last job before you go on to the federal bench.
And you mentioned the unitary executive theory. Of course, one of the obstacles that will be placed in front of, and it's boulder-sized, any reform moment that might come are the doctrines the Supreme Court has adopted and in some instances sort of largely made up. The Trump v. U.S. decision on immunity, which I read as giving vast immunity to presidents to evade the law, not just the criminal law. You actually think it's a little fuzzier than that, as I understand.
I think there are opportunities. The criminal immunity case is one where this is just a question that should not come up. Because, we got through all these years of the presidency, and the only decisions we had—
If it's a crime, it's not an official act, in a sense.
Well, that's going to be the escape clause. I think that's the way you fix this decision. But the Supreme Court ruled in Nixon versus Fitzgerald in the 1970s, if you've got a grievance against the federal government, you can't sue the president. Fitzgerald was a whistleblower who said he was wrongly fired from the Air Force, and he sued Nixon, and the Supreme Court said Nixon had nothing to do with this. You're just going to gum up the works of everyone who's got in this case, a legitimate grievance against a superior, sues the president. No civil action against the president in his official capacity. And then we get to the Paula Jones case where the president is accused of having sexually harassed a woman before he became president, and that's obviously an unofficial act. And yes, you can sue the pre-president in his unofficial capacity, and that's it. That's
9-0, and they said, we can do this because it won't have any impact on Bill Clinton's presidency. But I digress.
Yeah. But both of those, if I put to you the question of the doctrine, in both cases you say the doctrine sounds like pretty plausible, actually. Turns out the night before being sworn in, the president-elect gets blind drunk, gets in his car, runs over somebody.
Can you right.
Obviously, the answer has to be yes to that question.
Right.
But the Supreme Court took on this question of what happens to a sitting president. And this is a case where you say, you know what, we don't want to answer this. Because if the answer is no, if the president has immunity, that's the end of constitutional government. But if the president doesn't have immunity, that's every kind of nightmare. Why? And Mr. President, why did you have to break all those laws? Why did you do this?
But of course, that's what they could have ruled. And indeed, from what we know in terms of reporting in the New York Times and elsewhere, they could have had a unanimous ruling that said, well, there are indeed some limits on the prosecution of former presidents. Whatever they are, it's not this.
Yes.
And instead, John Roberts chose to forge a conservative majority opinion that went much further than that, I do think.
It's the Roe v. Wade of the right, I think. It's like a doctrine you didn't have to write based on no textual evidence, no constitutional structure. We're just making this up.
Vibes.
We're pulling it out of the air. So, but I think it is possible to narrow it. I think probably the Roberts Court may be uncomfortable, may like the theory more than the practice of what they've just done.
Democratic president, they may discover new avenues for legal accountability, perhaps.
And it does wait on the fact finder say trying to overthrow the government is not an official act of the president.
But now what about the unitary executive theory? I'm assuming you think that the concept of a unitary executive theory in some way is not delusional.
Yeah, I think we shouldn't be drawn into this argument. It would be because what I think in the Trump case, the things that are happening are so bad. The more you describe them as what they are, the more
you call it a theory, the less you're actually in touch with reality.
So I do think there is an unholy, not an unholy, but a dangerous working alliance between the legal far left and the legal right to abstract what Trump has done. And the legal left, because they want to say we want to get to the things that all the Republican presidents do. And the legal right is we don't want you to get to any of the things that any of the Republican presidents do. And I think the course of wisdom here is to sever the Trump presidency and to say this really is a distinctive phenomenon. And unitary executive, I don't know. Can the president take a jet No. Can the president's family take $500 million in exchange for releasing America's most precious computer chips to a place where they're not going to be secure? No, he can't do any of those things. Can the president organize a mob to try to kill the Speaker of the House? No. They're interesting questions. If the president orders a drone strike and it hits the wrong person, that's an interesting question. It didn't happen. That's not what has happened in the past 4 years. Let's focus on the things that did happen and let's fix those. And let's try not to abstract the Trump presidency too much and avoid this thing of people want to fight about doctrine when we have real crimes that need to be investigated, held to account, and prevented in the future.
So much of what you've been discussing, so much of what we've been discussing, in fact, could be addressed by a Congress that stood up for itself, that had eaten its Wheaties, even with a president of the same party in power.
Yeah.
The central fact in some ways of this moment is Congress not doing that.
Yeah.
And we've got the Supreme Court, which in some instances is though we don't know yet, but has been very deferential to exertions of presidential authority. How do you create a politics where you can get things right and where you can have the kind of response that you think is needed?
Yeah. Look, I think the politics of this are difficult in the following way. It really is true that these are abstract issues that matter a lot to people who have more margin of security and comfort in their lives and mean less to people with less margin of security and comfort in their lives. And the idea that there was this great rule of indignation after Watergate, people forget how bad the economy was in 1974, 75. If the middle 70s had been as prosperous as the late 90s, Watergate would have had a very different ending.
Bill Clinton's approval rating and Richard Nixon's approval ratings were not solely because of what people thought of them.
Right. So we need to understand that we're and the people who believe in reform shouldn't be intimidated when people say this is kind of an elite game. You say, yeah, the job of good elites is to build good institutions. They also have to meet the needs of non-elite people for economic security and a decent social safety net and prosperity and rising incomes. They have to do all of that. But they can't use the need to meet bread and butter issues as a reason to dismiss the concerns with making sure – because ultimately the success of the economy and everything else that matters to people who have less margin depends on the vitality and the integrity of the institutions. So this is going to be an elite game. There's just no getting around that. And Congress –
But that's okay.
But that's okay. Don't be intimidated by that. The original Constitution was an elite project too. And if the Articles of Confederation had brought prosperity, there would have been no demand for the 1787 Constitution. And so this is going to require some people a little bit away from the daily work of politics. And I think we've learned that Congress may not be the place, the present-day Congress, where these reforms begin. They may have to begin with some kind of commissions convened by the executive branch to offer advice. It may require some executive orders. And they may require the executive, the future executive, to do things that are uncomfortable enough that Congress says, maybe a law would be less painful. Like if you're going to do all this global Magnitsky acting all around the world, maybe we'd rather, and it's hurting some people we care about, maybe we'd rather see a domestic Magnitsky Act with due process, which is not applied retroactively. That will be less punitive to people who may deserve punishment, but which will be more stable for the future.
And the last question is, how do you persuade a president, future presidents of either party, to give up power in some measure, to restrain themselves in some measure, to not merely take the lesson of this moment being, hey, I can get away with a lot and I want climate change action, so let's use the emergency powers for that, or something else that I might substantively agree with, but constitutionally it falls right into the same rut.
You get them on record in advance of the election. That's the only recourse. And many of the reforms of the post-Watergate period were signed by President Carter because he had promised to do them in the elections of 1976. And Carter did that because the election of 1976 was a very close election in a very different kind of political system, one in which the opinions of people who cared about things like conflict of interest were up for those people could have been comfortable with either Carter or Ford, and were in important ways uncomfortable with both Carter and Ford. So that block of voters, never big, but in those days important, they may be important again. One of the things that we are seeing happening as the two parties resort in the 2020s is the Republican base is rural and less educated and more under economic stress, and the Democratic base is in the cities and a little better educated, but also under economic stress of different kinds. And it's not that Ann Romney is going to decide the election, but Ann Romney may be the voter who's most up for grabs in the election of 2028, and her opinions on things like a cleaner government may turn out to be important at the margin where it counts.
David Frum, thank you for being here. Thank you for your powerful voice, the insight you bring, and the moral clarity you bring to this in your writing, in your tremendous podcast, and everything else. We all benefit from it, and thanks for being part of this conversation.
Thank you, Michael.
And thank you to all of you for being with us for what I certainly have enjoyed as a really stimulating conversation. If you've enjoyed this, if you've enjoyed all the times you had the chance to talk about what can come next after this moment of peril for our Constitution, please subscribe to this podcast, to The Briefing. You can do so at all the various platforms where it's available. Please give us a good rating. Please let your friends know. It's important that we all be talking together about what's going on right now. Thanks so much for being with us.